Welcome to our webinar, Anti-Semitism in America, How Bad Is It? My name is Dale Atkins, and I'm deeply honored to be your moderator tonight. The webinar is a collaborative effort presented by ADL Connecticut, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. All of the 7 federations in Connecticut are participating. We are grateful to find it particularly meaningful to have this collaboration during this particular time of polarization and rising anti-Semitism. We are so pleased to have as our presenters Kenneth Jacobson and Mark Weitzman. Both of these leaders have inspiring, illustrious biographies, and I invite you to read them at your leisure. In the interest of time, I am going to highlight a few points from their many years of contribution to the field. Kenneth Jacobson is the Deputy National Director of the Anti-Defamation League and serves in multiple capacities, including representing ADL, writing on subjects related to ADL's concerns and mission, speaking to groups throughout the country and the world, and educating ADL staff and volunteers about the history and legacy of ADL, about which he knows a lot since he has served in many capacities within the organization for nearly 50 years. Kenny graduated from Yeshiva University and Columbia University with bachelor's and master's degrees in history. Mark Weitzman is Director of Government Affairs and of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is the Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations and a member of the official United States delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, which you'll be hearing referred to as IHRA in the evening, where he currently chairs the Museums and Memorials Working Group. He is a participant in the Program on Religion and Foreign Policy of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mark is the author of numerous publications and co-edited the award-winning anthology, Anti-Semitism, The Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal. He is currently editing A History of Anti-Semitism, which is scheduled for publication in 2021. I'd like to thank you both for being here tonight. I'll invite Kenny and Mark to offer brief opening statements, which will be followed by our interview and conversation. And in our final 10 minutes together, we will address your questions. Please write your questions in the Q&A, which you will find on your Zoom bar. Please do your best to edit your questions to their essence so we can get to as many as we can. I want to emphasize that we will be using the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. Also, we are very fortunate to have with us Steve Ginsburg from the ADL, Michael Cohen from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and David Warren from the Jewish Federation, who represent the 3 sponsoring organizations for tonight's webinar. They are watching and will be available to respond to specific questions via video. A special thank you to Anne Martha Pitikoff for chairing this event, and for all of you who have set up and organized and done all the work behind the scenes. I would really like to say a special shout out to Alana Blum Butler, Greg Rose, Sam Schoenberg, and Lisa Ratcliffe. And Kenny and Mark, your profound insights over the course of your careers have guided us through the complexities surrounding anti-Semitism. We are so grateful to have you here for this critical conversation. And if you will, I invite you to please share your introductory remarks with us now. Kenny, would you begin?
Sure. Thanks, Dale, for those kind comments. Really an honor to be here and to share the platform with Mark, whom I've known for many years, not quite my 50 years at ADL, but for quite a while. And it's also a pleasure to have in attendance my colleague, Steve Ginsburg, and my former colleague, David Warren. So it's a really lovely occasion. In my brief introduction, I thought I would talk about one question that I get often during this surge of anti-Semitism. And the question in different ways is basically, why now? Why is it happening now? What's going on that's created that? And I would suggest that there are factors specifically related to the Jewish people that are indicative, as well as factors that are more broad-based but affect the issue of anti-Semitism. And I always start with one of my favorite subjects, which is what I call the loss of shame about the Holocaust. When the Holocaust took place and the first pictures of Auschwitz appeared, people were shocked by what they saw. Anti-Semitism didn't disappear, but there was tremendous shame about manifesting anti-Semitism. And so for decades, we quote unquote benefited from that sense of shame about what anti-Semitism had led to. We are now several generations removed. Young people in most surveys hardly know anything about the Holocaust. And that sense of shame about manifesting anti-Semitism is dissipating. And I think that is an overall factor here in the United States, even more so, I would say, in Europe. But that loss of shame about anti-Semitism is, in my view, one of the more important factors as to why we're going through what we are. The second is what I refer to, and we can expand on this later in the conversation, Dale, is what I call the unique element of anti-Semitism. And I think we'll chat about it later in more detail. But anti-Semitism shares characteristics with other forms of prejudice, things like stereotyping, xenophobia, discrimination. But anti-Semitism has at its core a unique element that, as I say, I could go into in more detail later on. But my favorite word for the environment that makes anti-Semitism possible, if not inevitable, is anxiety. When there's social, political, or economic anxiety in modern society, you can be sure that anti-Semitism will be, and we're living at a time on many levels of that. As I said, well, I'm sure we will explore this in our later conversation. The third element that's specifically related to the Jewish people is the issue of anti-Zionism as a guise, sometimes a cover for anti-Semitism. Again, going back years when anti-Semitism was no longer fashionable because of the images of the Holocaust. The new anti-Semitism was in the form of anti-Zionism. We're not anti-Jewish, said the folks. We're just criticizing the state of Israel. And after all, Israel's a state like other states, so why can't we criticize them? And of course, as many of us have talked for, so of course, we're not talking about legitimate criticism of Israel. We're talking about something very different. And that element of years and years, just on November 10th, it was the anniversary of the Zionism racism resolution at the UN, which sort of played into this idea, after all, if Israel and Zionism are racist, then of course criticism. So I would say those are the specifically Jewish factors that have all come into play at this time. And then we have the more broad-based issues of society. You referred, Dale, in your opening to them, some of the polarization that's existing, the partisanship that's existing, all of that kind of thing creates an environment in which conspiracy theories are much more rife than they usually are. Of course, with the COVID situation, we're seeing that manifest. And once you go down that path of conspiracy theories, you can be sure that the most favorite conspiracy theory of all, the Jews and their control of things, will come into play. And so the polarization is playing into it. And of course, there's social media, which is that new element, not that the content is new, but the ability to disseminate it, to legitimize it, to get people to act it, all of the things on social media that we talk about so often have created a new element. And when you have the existing anxiety, and when you have that loss of shame, and when you have anti-Zionism as a guise for anti-Semitism, and you have polarization, and then you add to it the vehicle of social media, we shouldn't be so surprised. It becomes almost a perfect storm. And I would just conclude this very brief look at why now the role of the President of the United States is something that we can't ignore. I never want to believe that there's a kind of linear cause and effect between the things the President has said and action. When the terrible tragedy of Pittsburgh, some people say, well, it was Trump's fault. And I think that is much too simplistic. But he did use rhetoric that at least gave license in the minds of some people to act out on their anti-Semitism. And so I think we're gonna, and as I will talk later on, I'm sure Mark will as well, one of my basic principles in all of this work we do is that anti-Semitism doesn't belong to one ideological group, one party, one community. It can come from the right, it can come from the left, it can come from majority communities, it can come from minority communities. So I want to make clear that's what it is, but you can't ignore the role that the President has played to enable, if you will, of that. So I would just stop there because I know all these things we'll talk about in greater detail.
We will indeed, and thank you for that overarching and very comprehensive overview, because that we will try and touch on as many of those as possible. Mark, would you please share with us your introductory remarks?
You're not off, Mark. You got to unmute, Mark.
Thank you, Dale, and thanks, Kenny, for the technical assistance as well. And I also want to thank Anna Martha Pittigoff for really having the idea to bring us all together on this. It's been, as Kenny said, we've known each other for a long time. This is the first time I think we're ever sharing a platform together. And very much of really a privilege for me to be with someone that I've admired so much for so long. So I'm grateful for that opportunity as well. I think Kenny gave a really great comprehensive statement. I'm not going to really change anything or go in a different direction in the content in terms of what he said, but I want to actually take it and amplify it in a certain way. And our discussion tonight is framed in the United States, history of anti-Semitism then and now, how bad it is in the United States. And I want to point out that in some ways we are also going through kind of a shock period, because we had figured, and Kenny had described it well, that in the post-Holocaust era, post-World War II era, anti-Semitism was diminishing, was marginalized, was on the extremes, and we had kind of felt that for many of us, that we had been past it, or past the worst of it. And the reality is that anti-Semitism, as we know, is embedded in American history. It's embedded in other places as well, but speaking of the United States, I'm just going to go back to Connecticut's in between, the New York-Boston axis. So one example going back to New York, from the original founding, the icon of New York, Peter Stuyvesant, who in 1654 wrote back to his bosses in New Amsterdam that the deceitful race, meaning Jews, should not be allowed to further infect and trouble the new colony. Now, obviously, we know that did not happen and he was overruled and Jews came in. But going really back to the founding of New York, there was an attempt to keep Jews out. And if we go back to 1944, the middle of World War II, the war that we were fighting to defeat Hitler and the Nazis and their ideology and so on, after news accounts had become coming out to the US about what was happening in Auschwitz and elsewhere in terms of the Shoah, the Holocaust, there were literally gangs of youth marauding and attacking Jewish targets, stores, individuals in New York and Boston in the middle of 1944 that actually required both the mayor of New York, LaGuardia, and the governor of Massachusetts, Saltonstall, to appoint committees and commissions to investigate, to see what could be done about it. But this was literally as we were fighting the Nazis across the shore, anti-Semitism was still taking a violent turn literally in Boston and New York. And if we fast forward, and I'm not going to do a whole history course here, but we fast forward to the 1980s, starting with the murder of the Jewish radio talk show host, Alan Berg, and then going through the 1990s when there were attacks at JCCs in Seattle and Los Angeles, and there were murders in Chicago. 9 people were murdered, 9 Jews were murdered, and a couple of African-American people were killed in an anti-Semitic and racist shooting, and culminating in even up to 2009 when a neo-Nazi entered the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and shot and murdered an African-American guard, Jews have still been targeted, violently targeted. What was different, and this is the point, and Kenny touched upon this, I think, in his last remark, what was different was all those were coming from the extremes, and all those were denounced by every level of responsible leadership, from law enforcement to political leaders to religious leaders, communal leaders, etc. They were all denounced. I'm going to suggest that Charlottesville was a little bit of a tipping point that was different. We had questions going in the last presidential election, 2016. There were all sorts of issues, but the fact that there was not a clear, immediate denunciation of the events in Charlottesville, I think whether that was intentional or not intentional, I can't get into motives of other people and what's in their hearts, but it allowed segments of society to feel that they were legitimized, that their thoughts, their patterns of anti-Semitism had traction, not just on the fringes, but in the political mainstream, all the way up to the White House. And this sense of empowerment, which was channeled and further erupted through social media as well, created an environment when you factor in Corona and all the concerns and issues related to that and the uncertainty. We know anti-Semitism flourishes in troubled times. We have a perfect storm in a sense right now. We have the times that allow it to flourish. We have the conspiracy theories that target, let's say, an individual like George Soros, who I disagree with him on a lot of things, but he certainly has become a really an anti-Semitic lightning rod for many in the United States and outside. And when we didn't have clear leadership, clear political moral leadership to reject that, well, we have a situation that's been unparalleled, certainly in recent memory, and that's what we're facing now. Again, I don't want to, I mean, I think Kenny did a great job in summing up, so I don't want to go into more, and I'll stop right there. But I think that really kind of gives us a picture of where we're at the current time.
It does indeed, and I think that, again, you enhance the arc by giving us more of a historical perspective. And to follow up on that, Mark, as we go into the formal questions, I'd just like to ask you to expand a little. We know that anti-Semitism has been around since biblical times, but why is it so important to have a formal working definition now of anti-Semitism, something that you have worked tirelessly to see happen and come to be? And what do you hope the impact of that formal working definition of anti-Semitism would be?
Well, thanks. I think what you're referring to the working definition, non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism that was adopted by IHRA that you referred to earlier, which is the only international and intergovernmental body that's whole focus is dealing with Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And it is an intergovernmental body in a way that has a political commitment from the member states. There are now 34 member states in it, including the US, Israel, Germany, Austria, the Baltics, Croatia, all these countries. And IHRA in 2016, I introduced this definition, working definition of anti-Semitism, and it took 5 years to get it adopted because it requires consensus, meaning every country has to sign off on it. And it was a very difficult diplomatic path to go. It was adopted under the Romanian chairmanship, and I want to laud Romania and the late Ambassador Mihnea Constantinescu, who led the Romanian effort on this, without which it never would have happened. But we got it adopted in 2016, in May 2016, in the Bucharest meeting. Why was that important? It was important because for the first time, we had a sense of what anti-Semitism is with a definition that has some sort of official status. So, I mean, we all say we know what anti-Semitism is. I once began an article saying every Jew is an expert on anti-Semitism. But the reality is that it's not so clear. Kenny pointed out one aspect of it, which is the introduction of anti-Semitism in the guise of anti-Israel criticism, which was obviously really not so present before 1948 and picked up with the UN and so on. So that was one aspect. Our definition was a body of text along with a series of 11 examples, and a number of the examples related to Israel. We did have a specific clause in it that criticism of Israel, like any other state, is legitimate and cannot be considered anti-Semitic. But there are ways accusing Israel of being a Nazi state, or essentially denying the legitimate rights of Jews to a national homeland, in essence, is a double standard that is anti-Semitic. But we also wanted to get a little bit back to what was called classical anti-Semitism. And here I'm just going to point out that in many ways, anti-Semitism is embedded in Western culture. It was part of the Christian world that was repudiated after World War II by the Vatican, by most mainstream Protestant churches. They've been an extraordinary revolution in overturning these teachings of contempt and heritages of anti-Semitism. But nonetheless, it is still, in some ways, still around. If we go to, I think many of us watched appalled at the fires that threatened Notre Dame in Paris about a year and a half ago. But if you look at even at Notre Dame, over one of the lintels, over one of the doors, are the classical figures of the triumphant church and the broken synagogue, showing again the triumph of Christianity, the subjugation of Judaism. And those symbols are sometimes even unconsciously sitting there waiting to be activated again. So we needed to target that. The eruption of anti-Semitic violence in Europe in the early part of the 21st century was another trigger. I think I could illustrate it best by a couple of quick examples. 2014 in Germany, a synagogue in Germany is firebombed as a result of protests of what's happening in Gaza that summer. A German court says, we would say that's anti-Semitism. Clearly, a firebombing of a synagogue with Jews in it. A German court, followed by an appeals court, ruled that it was protected political speech. A couple of years later, here in New York at Vassar, a Rutgers professor gave a speech in which he alleged that Israelis were harvesting organs of Palestinians, a modern version of the blood libel. Her defenders said maybe she was wrong, maybe it was stupid, maybe it was mischievous, whatever, but it wasn't anti-Semitic. Last summer, Louis Farrakhan in his July 4th talk referenced Jews as being part of the synagogue of Satan, in the same talk in which he said he wasn't anti-Semitic. So we have people clearly, I think, in a certain way saying things or doing things that are anti-Semitic, and yet there's a tension between them or their defenders calling them out for being anti-Semitic. So we needed something very specific and very concrete, and that's where this practical working tool comes into effect. To make it very quick, I was actually incredibly surprised by the traction that it has gained. It has now been adopted or endorsed by around 30 countries, starting with the UK, the EU, the OAS, even in the United Nations. The newly appointed focal point, former Spanish Foreign Minister Morentinos, announced the last 2 weeks ago that he would like to see all 193 UN member states adopted. And in his report to this General Assembly, Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, Ahmed Shahid, recommended its use at the UN as well as an educational and political tool. It's been adopted now by the largest group of imams in the world. So it's making traction in the Muslim world. In an institute of Bahrain recently announced that just again the past month that they were adopted in Kosovo and Albania. 2 Muslim countries in Europe have adopted it. So we're seeing that it really has become something that answers a need, a very specific need, and bringing it back home to the United States under the Obama administration. It was adopted by the State Department. It's used for the annual report that the State Department delivers on religious freedom, anti-Semitism included in that. It's used to judge what anti-Semitism is, and it's an evaluative tool. Yeah. It's not a tool of legal censorship. And President Trump's executive order of last year applied it to the Department of Education specifically, and others as well. Again, if there's a question about whether a given act on a campus was anti-Semitic, this is the tool that you can turn to measure it against. It doesn't mean that it prevents people from saying what they want to say. It means that if a question arises, we have some way that was created by experts with international acceptance so that we're all speaking the same language to effectively begin to deal with anti-Semitism. Otherwise, we're kind of spinning off into the ether at times about it.
Right, and I think that, and thank you for that explanation. When people want to find it and read it in its entirety, where would they go?
They can go to the website of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is holocaustremembrance.org.
Thank you. I want to now kind of piggyback on that with my next question to Kenny. Thank you, by the way, for really making the distinction between anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry by bringing it into, what's always present with anti-Semitism. I'd like you to expand it a little, given what you also said about extremism. We have a rising tide of extremism, both left and right. And most Jews seem to be somewhere in the middle. They don't fit perfectly into either category. Let me say it that way. How do you see the difference between anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Semitism on the right?
Okay, so I think there are basically two different questions embodied in what you just said. The first is, in what ways is anti-Semitism different from other forms of prejudice? You know, we at ADL, I know at the Wiesenthal Center, we deal not only with anti-Semitism, but other forms of hate. And we see very often the connections between various haters. And part of it is to identify the commonalities of hate.
Mm-hmm.
I refer to things like discrimination, stereotyping, xenophobia that are characteristics of anti-Semitism, but also of racism and anti-LGBT, you know, and all the other forms of prejudice that have in common. What makes anti-Semitism, in my view, different and unique, and really answers many of the historic anomalies that have been written about anti-Semitism, how long it's lasted. We go back thousands of years of it, how lethal it has been, of course, culminating in the Holocaust, the contradictions of anti-Semitism, where Jews are accused at one and the same time of being capitalists and communists, the phenomena of anti-Semitism without Jews. All these phenomena about anti-Semitism, in my view, come down to what I consider the hardcore of anti-Semitism that makes it different than other things, which is the idea that Jews may seem to be normal people like you and me, says the anti-Semite. But in fact, the reality of the Jew is something hidden, something conspiratorial, something poisonous, something all-powerful. In other words, the Jew is a hidden menace to the world. And I think that theme, first of all, means that anytime, as I use the word anxiety, there's social, political, or economic anxiety, that theme is easy to conjure up because political leaders, so for example, Mahathir, the prime minister of Malaysia in the 90s, when they had a recession in a country where there were almost no Jews whatsoever, he said, the reason you're suffering economically is not because of this or that, but it's because of the Jews' control of international currency in a country where people never even met a Jew. And I think the basic point there is that Jews are sometimes in danger exactly when they're doing well. In other words, most other groups, it's sort of looking down at those groups. You know, racism is about that. But very often with Jews, it's exactly when they're doing well that they may be most vulnerable, because this idea of Jewish control, Jewish power now seems to have a little bit of credence to it. And of course, the intellectual embodiment of this concept was the infamous fraudulent document, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And you have to just picture this. It was written by the Russian secret police around 1903. Jews in Russia were nowhere. They had no power, no wealth or anything. And yet here was a document that claimed that they discovered the secret conversations of Jewish leaders to take over the world. And the reason it's to this day has such power is because it put down in paper what people in a way had believed for centuries. Again, this idea of Jews having poisonous power. And of course, the ultimate culmination is the way the Nazis used it, the way Goebbels used it, the idea that you shouldn't only dislike Jews, you have to defend yourself against the old poisonous Jew. And so this means that we have to explain all this to people. So particularly on the progressive left, people say, well, Jews are doing so well. What are you concerned about? You know, you're not in a situation like other minorities. Look, and so it requires, but it's so vital to understand that sometimes the greatest threat to Jews can come exactly when they're doing well because of this concept, which is really different than other forms of prejudice. Now, on the subject of the right and the left, I'm not in the business of trying to say where there's a greater danger. I think there are just different kinds of situations. There's no doubt, and Mark referenced it with referring to Charlottesville, there's no doubt that what we've witnessed in the last few years, the violence coming from white supremacists and people on the right, is a terrible phenomenon, something that we truly haven't experienced in the community for quite a long time. And it has raised all kinds of questions about insecurity, which didn't exist for quite a while in the Jewish community. And so there's no doubt that the violence of the extreme right is the number one challenge that we face. But I would say that the problems coming from the left are much more subtle, because the left always presents itself as doing good. Even the British Labour Party, that was accused of out and out anti-Semitism, tried to frame everything it was doing in terms of doing good. So people on the right are very blatant in their hatred of Jews and blaming Jews for every sin under the sun. On the left, there's always a kind of nuance to it, which already becomes more complicated. And of course, in many cases, because we all work for justice for minority groups, many of us have relationships with many groups, and sometimes there's a hesitancy to say what it is. But I would simply say that despite the nuance, there are serious problems on the left. And what I would say the main problem on the right is the violence. The main problem on the left, in my view, is it's creeping into the mainstream. And exactly because it is nuanced and because it presents itself not as actually hating Jews, but this human rights issue or that kind of issue, it is a challenge to deal with. But in some ways, one could argue, I know in the Jewish community, we have folks who worry terribly about the extreme right, and we have others who feel, you know what, in the long run, maybe the challenge of the left is even greater because it seems to be infiltrating into mainstream circles. So you see on campuses around the country, and we follow regularly, we do reports each week on anti-Zionist activities all over this country, and many of them are veer into potential anti-Semitism, or at least making Jews feeling uncomfortable. So I would say that we shouldn't get into the business of which is worse or not. We should examine the distinctive element of the problem on the extreme right and the distinctive element, and develop strategies to deal with the particular problem. The commonality is we all need to identify problems in a nonpartisan way and then stand up against them.
Thank you. That's very, very good advice, and I think somewhat difficult to do when there is so much polarization. To piggyback on that, Mark, I would ask, how can we effectively advocate politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, about not only what anti-Semitism is, but how can we change the public dialogue that's taking place so more people really understand what anti-Semitism is?
Well, I think that there are a couple of key elements here. And again, I think we do piggyback on one each other, and Kenny alluded to some of them. So first of all, I think that one is to get across that anti-Semitism is a clear and present danger. For too long, Jews have been viewed as having made it in the phrase, being a part of I'll say elites of American society. And what I mean by that is not that Jews have no right to be there, but the reality is that anti-Semitism, as I pointed out earlier, was never so far from the surface. And now, really, once again, Jews are targeted. To be blunt about it, the question of identifying Jews as, quote, white, and whatever that means, puts Jews in a certain specific category that automatically, if you follow that line of reasoning, and this is what a lot of people on the left are doing that Kenny was talking about, especially on the extreme left, if you follow that reasoning in terms of race theory and things like that, critical theory, basically means that nothing that Jews can do really takes them out of the protected class, and there's no reason to be concerned about them because we're in the upper class. That's it. That's just by definition, that's where we belong. That's the box that we go into. And if that's the case, then there's absolutely no reason to worry about them because we're on the wrong side of history right now and society. The reality obviously is a lot more complicated, and the reality is that that's absolutely false. We do know that not every Jew is wealthy and successful. We do know that there are, certainly a large number and a great percentage, I think, that people realize, of Jews of color, of Jews coming from every different race and ethnic background, and it's just a false construct. So we have to figure out a way to make sure that people understand that it's false and understand as well that Jews are, as we're talking about, in a position of being threatened right now in the United States in ways that they have not been for so long. But on top of that, I referenced Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur's report earlier. When he spoke to the General Assembly at the United Nations, Shahid was very blunt, and he had one sentence in his report that has stayed with me ever since he gave it last September. And the sentence was simply that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. Anti-Semitism, if allowed to flourish, to go unchecked, literally means that democracy is in danger. And again, historically, we know that Jews have traditionally been the first targets when people wanted to undermine a democracy, wanted to undermine and destroy a system of human rights. And that's one of the reasons why Holocaust distortion is so important to combat today. Because, again, Kenny pointed this out earlier, and I totally support it. The Holocaust became a basis for a paradigm shift in both the United States and in Europe. After seeing the results of the Holocaust, pure anti-Semitism, pure race theory could no longer be accepted because people saw that it led to Auschwitz in its starkest, crudest path. Having done that, a lot of the institutions that were developed in light of that, whether it's the United Nations, the EU, war crimes tribunals, things like that, that grew out of the reaction to the Holocaust, the idea of Europe of creating a common community that would not be so quick to go to war with each other and so on. These are all under attack today. And they're under attack today for various reasons, and they undermine the structures that have created liberal democracies. The United States is no different from any of the other countries. We're facing some of those same attacks on institutions as well. So the idea that anti-Semitism is just limited to Jews, the impact just being limited to Jews, is actually one that's just not true. So I think that if we can get the message across to our politicians, to our leaders, that this is something that obviously targets Jews. It's not a Jewish problem in a sense, it's a problem of society. And this has larger implications and greater implications. There's implications for every other minority group, every other group that could potentially be targeted. The old saying, it begins with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. So I think we have to get that across. And at the same time, I think that, again, it's not a partisan issue. One of the dangers involved has been anti-Semitism has become used as a political football recently, where groups on both the right and the left take great joy in pointing fingers to the other side and calling out the other side and accusing them of anti-Semitism while ignoring the anti-Semitism in their own front yards. This is the great Israeli human rights advocate, Natan Sharansky, said this, and I remember talking to him about it. The reality is that we have success when people on the right face up and confront anti-Semitism on the right, and people on the left face and confront anti-Semitism on the left. And only then will we begin to have sincere efforts. And there are some efforts now in Congress, for example, in both the House and the Senate. There are bipartisan task forces on anti-Semitism in each place, led by a Republican and a Democrat. They work together. They have broad support in both houses. And it's phenomenal. It's one of the most encouraging things that I can see is that these senators and these congressmen realize the necessity to cut across the swamp, to use a phrase, of partisan politics that's infested Washington these days, and to realize that this is at least one issue that they can come together and work together in a bipartisan fashion.
Yes, and that does, it does give us a bit of hope. I want to now switch to Kenny for a moment before we go overseas, while we're staying in the United States for a bit longer. In our country, we protect the First Amendment right to free speech, but we use social, societal standards to make tolerance and acceptance a part of what protects Jews and other groups that are marginalized. So given how prolific the spread of hate is through social media, which you mentioned before, and often it's spread in social media under the guise of partisanship, it seems that there's a very little downside to being an anti-Semite. So I'd like you to share your thoughts with us on this. With everything going on in the social media, why is being an anti-Semite almost acceptable?
Yeah, well, your point about the First Amendment goes back to the historic way that at least we have dealt with anti-Semitism and indeed all forms of hate. I remember my former boss, Abe Foxman, was once asked what was the most significant event that ADL got involved with, and he pointed to something that happened even before his time and before my time, which was that we promoted and got passed legislation in the state of Georgia in 1950-51, which was known as the anti-mask law. And that was when the KKK was rampaging. And we believed in the First Amendment that they had a right to demonstrate, as terrible as they were, but we basically said they can't demonstrate anonymously having the hoods over their faces. And we got past the anti-mask law, and the anti-mask law, sort of took away a lot of the aura of the Klan, because when they took off the sheets, they were your next door neighbors and they weren't quite as, but more significantly related to your question, that was a basic way to fight hate, which is you don't censor it. You fight bad speech, hate speech with good speech. The problem in social media is that's a very challenging kind of thing because it's all over the place. You don't have the opportunity to get to the people who've been exposed to the hate. And therefore, you begin to say that you need some other steps. And therefore, for example, this past summer, we led this effort called Stop Hate for Profit against Facebook, because we had been dealing with Facebook. As I know the Wiesenthal Center involved with the issue as well. We've been dealing with them in Silicon Valley for 10, 15 years, trying to get them to take seriously the issues of hate, and they truly were not. And so we finally turned, and we got 1,000 corporations and others to join in this, in effect, boycott of Facebook for 1 month to impress upon them that this is the only way you're going to pay attention. So the fact of the matter is that it's not like, one of the things I think are important to keep in mind is that the American people are not becoming more anti-Semitic in this terrible time. We think of this as a surge of anti-Semitism, which it is in terms of incidents, in terms of violence. But our polling indicates that the attitudes towards Jews are as good as they've ever been in this country. There's always a certain number of anti-Semitic people in this country, but it's not increasing. So, but what's happening is that through social media, through some of the lack of leadership, those 30 million Americans who carry anti-Semitic attitudes, when we say 10, 11% of adults, before they never felt justified in acting out on that anti-Semitism. Now, because of all the factors that both of us have been talking about, some of those people are feeling that they can act it out. And social media plays into that. That was true with the killer in Pittsburgh, the killer in Poway, and other forms of hate. And so, again, it's not that the American people are becoming more anti-Semitic. I think in many ways, Jews are regarded very highly by most Americans. And in so many ways, Jewish life continues at the highlight. I think Mark is right in pointing out the history of anti-Semitism. But I also must say that I've argued that since 1970 or so, until fairly recently, there was no community in the world that came close to the level of comfort that American Jews have had. And I would argue probably in the 2,000-year history of the diaspora, the experience of Jews over the last 40 years or so have been beyond anything experienced. They're now going through a period where, yes, we are awakening to the fact that anti-Semitism is here in America. It's very serious and we have to deal with it. But so I always believe we need to keep a balance in our perspective. We need to identify the forms of hate and the real serious challenges that we have both from the right and the left going forward. But I also believe we need to recognize that if we can mobilize so many Americans, because the attitudes towards Jews in America remains at a high level.
And thank you for that more positive and hopeful, seeing the bright spot. I want to just, before we open up to the group, and I have some other questions for you too. I know that many people were concerned, and Mark, maybe you can speak with this to this point of the impact of Israel on the recent peace accords with Sudan and UAE and Bahrain in the overall geopolitical climate of anti-Semitism. And if you could kind of, relate it to home, that would be great.
Well, I think Kenny has actually alluded to some of it, which is that Israel has become a flashpoint for anti-Semitism. It's a convenient place, particularly on the far left and those who are trying to infiltrate mainstream as well. We see that in certain, far left of the Democratic Party, for example, where Israel is essentially considered a pariah state, to use the language that was once used. It's compared to the Nazis, and it's just, Jews are accused of dual loyalty and all the traditional anti-Semitic tropes. That is not necessarily, and only in America, obviously. That originated in many cases. The BDS movement originated in the Middle East. It grew out there, but it was certainly picked up and popularized in Europe. We've given a lot of intellectual credibility there, and then in some ways came over to the United States, as a product of that intellectual fertilization. It's been aided by European politicians and political institutions, places that want to try labeling Israeli products as being specifically from the West Bank, or comments by leading, European politicians that call Israel all sorts of names, cartoons that depict Israeli statesmen, or even Israel itself in all sorts of anti-Semitic methods and manners. So this is really something that, in many ways, all these extremist movements turn to Europe and look to Europe for intellectual leadership. The alt-right got some of its intellectual leadership, even though that's totally shattered now, and the alt-right is, in our rearview mirror in a way, but grew out of European intellectual currents. And I think that there's a lot of it that's happened that essentially traces back to Europe. Now, having said that, the peace agreements can be an incredible game changer in all that, because it removes some of the most virulent causes and actors in that. And particularly, I think a big question is going to be what happens with Saudi Arabia moving forward. Saudi Arabia for years had funded some of the worst forms of Wahhabism, that the extremist Islamist ideology that was transmitted both to the States and to Europe, that helped inspire some of the worst jihadist actions and propaganda and recruitment. And if Saudi Arabia decides to pull the plug on those efforts, especially as the guardians of Mecca and so on, that could be an extraordinarily positive move. We don't know what's going to happen there. It's all up in the air. There was certainly, the report of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit, and there were the questions of who, yes, what, no, and so on. The idea of a realignment of the Middle East with Bahrain and UAE and Saudi Arabia joining Israel in an alignment against Iran certainly is highly significant. The Iranians are going to continue what they're doing, even if, certainly if the JCPOA is renegotiated or brought back up again. They are still not going to stop the genocidal propaganda and proclamations against Israel. So it's just a really unsettled time. But for the first time, I think in a long time, there are glimpses of a positive future there, and just a reshaping of that area in the world, which would have a huge impact. If that happens, it's going to be very interesting. I'm reminded again, I guess I was an historian, trained as an historian, I keep thinking about this, but I'm reminded of those groups in the external communists in the West in the late 1930s who had a dance at Moscow's call and went from anti-Nazi, anti-fascist to a treaty, supporting a treaty with Nazi Germany, then back anti again, and they would go back and forth depending on the signals that were coming from the home country. In some ways, I think we're going to see something similar, because it depends on what the signals are and who's paying attention to them and who's not. But in terms of the intellectual currents that Kenny was talking about in, I think, leftist ideology, one of the things that we have to acknowledge as well is that there's a strain of, it's not just coming from the jihadist world, let's say, or the radical Islamic anti-Israel world, but it's coming from the, quote, anti-colonial strain that calls Israel an imperialist settler state, and no matter what else, will probably always be an enemy of Israel and an enemy of Jews.
Thank you for that, and giving it that context. And again, where will we go? We'll see. I have many more questions for you both, but I noticed at the time, and I'd like each of you, before I open this to the broader questions, if you could just give 3 specific recommendations for people in the audience that you have, that people can do, aside from giving money to organizations and lobbying their officials, to address the anti-Semitism in their communities. And then I'll open this up to questions from the audience. So Kenny, could you start with 3 specific recommendations that you have?
I mean, on a personal level.
Yes.
First of all, I would strongly urge everyone to report any incident to organizations like ADL, the Wiesenthal Center, or to law enforcement. And what I mean by incidents, not only something violent, which is obvious, but things that you see on social media that are really terrible, or any other form of an incident. I think that's something that we can all be on alert for and to do. Secondly, I would say is have conversations. Have conversations with family members. We all have relationships with people who are not Jewish, who may not understand the issues of Israel and even anti-Semitism. You know, we at ADL, the Connecticut ADL, has done a fantastic job over the years in education programs, a different program, whether the World of Difference or naming and bullying, all these kinds of things, informal and formal, in terms of conversations are really, and again, I would say the other one, I'll repeat it, is be nonpartisan. Whatever, we all have strong political views, but when it comes to an issue like anti-Semitism, put aside your partisanship. I agree very much with what Mark said about quoting Sharansky and all. I always say that whenever I'm asked about a political figure, whether they're serious about anti-Semitism, I say, are they ready to criticize their own side? It's easy for a person on the left to talk about white supremacy. It's easy for someone on the right to talk about anti-Israel, BDS and all that, but are you ready to stand up? So that's an important point. So I would say we can all do all these things on a personal level, aside from the larger lobbying and supporting of organizations.
Thank you. So now I'd like to try and take some of these questions from the audience, and thank you all for putting your questions in the Q&A. Let's see. Kenny, how do we maintain the real security for Jewish institutions while maintaining our open way of life as American Jews?
So that is a tremendous challenge, actually, one that I think is one of the major ones. Those of us who visit Europe and European Jewish communities really don't want us to become like those communities. What I mean by that is they have terrible problems over the years, much more serious overall than we have had in terms of violence and security issues. And you go to so many of those institutions, they have no choice. They become armed fortresses. And if you're a parent sending your kid to a day school and you have all that thing, it's not exactly a very welcoming environment, and yet they really feel they have no choice, and that's understandable. After Pittsburgh, of course, the heightened level of the stress on community organizations and institutions became something we haven't experienced in decades. And of course, our first priority is to protect our folks and our institutions. So we have to be serious, but we also need to figure out a way to keep what I referred to earlier as the most successful Jewish life, I would argue, in the history of the diaspora that we have had in this country over the last 40 years or so, where Jews are truly equal Americans, where we feel comfortable in our skin, where we feel, and how you can do that, I don't have a simple formula, but we need to keep both in mind. We obviously need to protect our folks and our people, but we also need to think of ways that people will feel that it's great to come to shul, it's great to come to sit, it's great to come to a Jewish organization, to an event. I know that there's going to be security, but I also feel comfortable as an American doing all these things. So I don't have a simple formula. There are people who deal with those issues who know far more about it than I do. But I think that should be the goal. First, obviously, to protect us, but to recognize this is still America, and Jews have this wonderful life here, and we have to find a way to maintain that life while still protecting our community.
Thank you. let's see, to Mark. ADL has shown in 2017 that 35% of Black America is anti-Semitic. How can we understand and address anti-Semitism in the Black community? Mark, do you have some ideas for this?
Well, I think that I'm going to draw upon a personal experience here. A
Thank
number of years ago, I was doing some work with our office in Chicago. This was probably about 15 years ago or more. And one of the things I was doing was going in and spending some time with I think it was totally African-American school. I think it was one of the Catholic schools, and it was an elite school, but it was in one of the worst areas of Chicago. And the kids, actually, I learned from them that at that point, at least, Chicago was the most segregated city in the United States, which I had never even realized at that point, not knowing enough of the history of it. And it taught me a couple of things. One is that I didn't know that, and I needed to know that before going in there because it obviously changed everything in terms of it. Secondly, I was shocked by how sympathetic and how open and how attracted these kids who were on a college track and working really hard to pull themselves out of the situation they found themselves, and they were, wearing school uniforms, shirts and ties, and so on. How attracted they were to the message of Louis Farrakhan, and we spent a lot of time talking about it. And I realized after a while that what attracted them was exactly what I just described: the sense of discipline, of upward mobility, of pulling yourself out, of dressing in a certain way that showed that you were not being, pulled down, and so on and so forth. And we went back and forth, and I finally said to them that, you could bake a cake with the most extraordinary ingredients, purest vanilla, flour, chocolate, et cetera, but if you put in just a little droplet of arsenic, that cake is still poison. And that kind of got to them in terms of the message of Farrakhan. But it was the other side of it that I realized that there is a sense of really embedded racism, systemic racism in the United States, that it's very hard sometimes for those of us who are not in that situation to comprehend. And I think the first part is listening. The second part, though, is not to just accept blindly. In other words, no matter what they were saying, I could not accept their admiration of Farrakhan, and I had to try to make them understand that that's not the path that you want to go down. That path has implications. So we've seen it this past year. There were a spate of celebrities who were endorsing or retweeting messages from Farrakhan. And it was extremely difficult. But some of them finally, through education, through outreach, were able to take the lead and say that they had learned and they were different. The Million Women's March a couple of years ago, it took some of really courageous women to stand up from within that group and to say that, I'm sorry, there is an atmosphere of anti-Semitism that's permeating this movement for social justice, and we cannot accept it. We have to separate ourselves from that. And I think that that's really important. It's important in a sense to be an ally, but at the same time to have an open eye and be able to stand up for ourselves and be critical when necessary, and to find allies within that community and within those communities, because they are there, they do exist. And I think that it is clearly a problem. It is clearly an issue. It is not a new issue. Maybe it's been brought out more by the recent circumstances, by the heightened tensions and polarity in this country. But we have a difficult path that we have to really work on without letting ourselves get torn apart as a nation.
Yeah, can I just add one? I just want to add to what Mark said, which is,
yes,
I think for those of us who have agendas working for justice and to fight against racism, we need to find a way, and I think it can be done, in which we continue the agenda to work for racial justice in this country, and still at the same time not pull punches when we see manifestations of anti-Semitism coming from the African American community. And I think we need to educate, and if there's a true relationship between the Jewish community and it has to be based on an honest assessment, not to be held hostage to those who, we get people say, why do you do these things to work for the African American community? Look at all the anti-Semitism. The answer is, we do the work for justice because it's the right thing to do, and it's important for this country and important ultimately for Jews. but at the same time, we need to be outspoken when we see manifestations, whether it's the Farrakhan thing, where it's disturbing. Farrakhan, we describe Farrakhan as the leading anti-Semite in the country, and the main reason, he's the only out-and-out anti-Semite who gets thousands of people who don't seem to be disturbed by his thing. So we need to be out there, but we also need to continue the work for justice in this country.
And I'd like to just follow up on that to say that we could obviously talk for so long, particularly about how we can have courageous conversations within our communities, where there are differences, where there are fears, where there are misunderstandings, and how we can bring people together in order to be who we are, and also fight for others and stand up for one another. I thank you so much for sharing your time and your perspectives. And obviously we could speak for many, many hours. I will say that within me, and I know within the audience, your words really resonate how much work there is to do. You resonate to help us deepen our understanding of where we are and where we need to go. And I'd like to also invite the audience to, if you enjoyed this program, if you want to see more of this kind of programming, that we're looking at possibilities of making this kind of conversation, like they're making this one the first in a series. And for some of the topics that we didn't have a chance to explore tonight, it would be good to focus on them in future conversations with expert panelists such as we had tonight. And if you're interested in future events, please feel free to offer some topics. You're going to be getting a follow-up email asking for your suggestions regarding future topics. And we really would appreciate you responding, and perhaps we can open this to an even larger community. And ADL and the Federation and the Simon Wiesenthal Center do amazing work. I know some of you were asking for the spelling of names of people who were mentioned. We can also, if you want to send some emails specifically, if you needed some clarification on things, send them to ADL, I think. That's where we can send them. Or you can send them to me and I'll send them along if you have specific questions. But for now, I want to thank you all for your time, your attention, and specifically to Kenny and Mark and all of the sponsoring organizations. This was an unbelievable opportunity to learn more about anti-Semitism. How bad is it? We have a lot of work to do, but we're also pretty strong. So thank you all, and till next time.